Hello and welcome back to the Dungeon Podcast, brought to you by Anti-Fragile Fitness. We have a full lineup today of myself. My name is Arthur Mena. I'm the head coach of Anti-Fragile Fitness. With me are my assistant coaches, Andrew and Cannonball Jake, as you can see. Today we are going to get into a subject about what is anti-fragility. Now, a lot of people like the name Anti-Fragile Fitness. It sounds cool. It sounds tough. It sounds like the kind of fitness where people are doing a bunch of really crazy lifts and whatnot. And part of that's true, but the real name Anti-Fragile comes from a book named Anti-Fragile by Lebanese author Nassim Taleb. Nassim Taleb hails from Lebanon, and he's had a rough go of it in life at certain times of his life due to the Lebanese Civil War that took place many decades ago. The core concept of anti-fragility is as follows: that there is no word in the human lexicon, or rather the English lexicon, apologies, that is a true opposite of fragile, meaning that with fragility, something gets destroyed. When something is fragile, it can't withstand pressure, it can't withstand randomness, it just disintegrates under both those external factors. There are words in the English lexicon like tough and robust, which are actually just a neutral middle ground when introducing something to pressure or randomness, meaning it's resistant to pressure or randomness. And lastly, there is anti-fragility, the term proposed rather by Nassim Taleb to describe things that gain with disorder, that when introduced to pressure and randomness, they actually get better. Just curious, Jake, before you and I first spoke, before you first joined Anti-Fragile Fitness, were you familiar with the text at all, or familiar with the term, or does the name just sound catchy?
It's interesting because, and I've spoken about this a few times within the group. I was actually familiar with Taleb's concepts, but not his work, through the work of a completely different author, which is Mark Quepit, who's written a few times on anti-fragile concepts in his self-help books. Although he doesn't credit Taleb directly with the idea. So I don't know if it's something that he's, not doing, but it was only brief mentions. It's not like he's written an entire book on the concepts. So what was interesting to me was that I actually had an idea of what anti-fragile was before I read Taleb's work. And when I read it after joining, it was like, oh, this sounds so familiar. Like, where have I heard all this before? And I ended up sort of referencing myself back to Mark's books and realizing that a lot of his work is indirectly inspired by a lot of Taleb's concepts. And I don't know whether those could be, organically generated, and they've seen the same things occur, which is like, well, when stress happens in certain situations, you can actually have, in some instances, things will disintegrate. In some instances, things will become, better from the stress. And I think that's a very obvious assessment if you're actually looking at things. I think most people come to realize that, but to put it into words is an entirely different thing, because a lot of people just brush that off as a part of life as opposed to something that should be sort of sought out.
Yeah, we're in a strange age right now and I was thinking about this morning, that a lot of the attitude that you see with sort of programs that you see online, not only ours, and a lot of content that you see that's catered to like the millennial and the Zoomer, and probably a bit down the line, Generation Alpha. It's like relearning things that were commonplace for generations that were sort of abandoned in the Boomer generation. It's really just the Boomer interruption into Gen X, that all of these concepts were sort of known inherently just by the way people embodied them generation after generation. But we're actually having to relearn those now. So it's not the type of thing where you can just say, oh, well, that's just common sense. Of course, if you're presented with a difficult situation, you need to make the best of it. That's not really the rhetoric for the Western world for a long time now. It's more of a victim mindset rhetoric. It's saying, it's okay to break down. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay. I mean, we've literally seen it's okay to be weak. right? So everyone's, for the most part, anyone who's wanting to leave that narrative that's sort of been present and accelerating since the 1960s, um, they're having to find ways to relearn concepts that weren't taught to them by their parents or grandparents. Um, Andrew, when you first came across the term anti-fragile, what first came to mind?
So I was not familiar with the book. So I thought that was a term that you had originally coined when I first heard it. And I thought it was mostly in reference to a training mindset focused on functionality, on longevity, on a functional strength, and that kind of thing.
I see. Yeah. When learning the concept anti-fragile itself, when we sort of go over in men's groups and book clubs for anti-fragile fitness, did anything come to mind about your childhood? Because I know you had a pretty squared away familial tradition where you grew up. You grew up with brothers. Did anything come to mind that was familiar?
No, not particularly. um, like I said, it was a pretty new concept for me. So no, that was my first exposure to it.
Copy that. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if I could be the one to come up with the term anti-fragile, but it's not something I can really get away with. Nassim Taleb, this text, it's the fifth in a series of texts. I actually haven't read his other four books. He references them quite a bit in Anti-Fragile. Anti-Fragile itself is about 562 pages. And I think at first, like the first notion that you get, the first idea you get with this book is that it would be a bunch of different ways to sort of win a tough man's contest. When actually it has a lot to do with mindsets of cutting your losses and making the best of situations, having lateral solutions, so not going directly ahead in your goal, but putting some other irons in the fire to eventually, over time, build your case to getting ahead in where you want to get in life. Systems that will not break when random stressors pop up, financial strategies for economic downturns. There's a lot that goes into it. Um, Jake, when you were first interacting with the text, what was the main thing that took you by surprise?
What took me by surprise initially was the similarity to Mark's work, because I thought that obviously having no experience of Taleb's work in and of itself, and him as the progenitor of the concept, what took me by surprise was that I didn't know what he was going to say when I was reading the book, but I felt like I'd already experimented with the systems that he was explaining and the concepts that he was explaining, and I'd seen them written down before, and that really took me by surprise, because it was like, have I already read this? I knew I hadn't read it, but I was having almost like a deja vu moment reading the book. I think one of the things about the concepts and the topics he discusses himself is the variety at which anti-fragility can be applied. And I think there are definitely, by the nature of by the nature of the concept itself, there are a limited amount of situations under which it can be applied. But the variety of situations which Taleb presents as examples for anti-fragile concepts, I really found that to be interesting, and I was quite shocked, because I thought he was going to use like a few key examples and build on them. But what he tends to do instead is actually draw from a wide array of situations and go, here's an idea, and here's an idea whether it wouldn't work, and here's why this isn't, here's why this is. Through the various concepts and devices that he terms under anti-fragile concepts. Especially when he's talking about reputation, investment, and then all the way through to picking a meal when he's out for dinner.
Yeah, like a concept you and I were talking about in one of our work sessions was polymathy, and I think anti-fragility rather is a concept that can be applied to polymathy when it comes to being met with unfortunate circumstances. You mentioned to me that someone who is an advanced level in two different fields is going to be able to outwork the expert, a person who's an expert in each of those fields, because he's going to be able to take outside concepts and apply them to those given circumstances of that singular field. This is somewhat, you can lateral this to anti-fragile fitness and how anti-fragile is applied to fitness, why this company has its name. There's this sort of notion that I see, there's this false dichotomy, this false ultimatum rather, that you see littered throughout the Instagram fitness world, where you either stick to your program no matter what, even if you're injured or even if your body isn't responding correctly, or you're overly cautious and you don't really embrace the stress stimulus that you have in front of you. If you go on vacation, you're a gym that doesn't have any, doesn't have a particular piece of exercise equipment and only has dumbbells up to 50, you kind of just say, oh, well, I can't work out now, I need to stick to the program, as opposed to making the best of what you have and applying that towards applying that towards your physical gains. We're obviously all big fans of Jocko Willink, but he kind of talks about that a lot in the Jocko podcast, where you don't just sort of crumble because the plan doesn't go according to plan. You take what's offered and you work on something else. So you've seen clips of him as well saying, oh no, I have an injured shoulder, I have a clipped wing, so what? I don't really need my shoulder all that much to max out on squats. I don't need my shoulder all that much to do 800-meter sprints. I don't need my shoulder all that much to throw 1,000 kicks on each leg. That's just the general attitude. As far as the system goes, I think things are a little different. You can't just apply a certain mindset towards it. Jake, you're an in-house systems guy. How do you see that playing out in general?
I think, like you said, with exercise selection and improvising when you don't have necessary equipment, I think like a lot of that comes from your ability as a person to think outside the box. Like, for instance, when you gave me seal rows, my first thing isn't, well, what can I use instead of seal rows because I don't have that specific piece of equipment? It's, okay, well, how can I replicate something that comes to as close to that as possible? Or how can I improvise that setup entirely? And that's what I did. And I actually went and made a short video on Instagram about it. Although I wanted to make an instructional video, I think I still will do that when I have the time. And by using, various pieces of equipment, including a regular freestanding bench and either a Smith machine or a squat rack or even a plyometrics box, it's very, very simple and easy to improvise something like a seal row. And what's funny to me is how unknown that is to most gyms, because the seal row is a fantastic exercise and really makes a lot of sense. It's like, why would you do a normal barbell row? I know there are benefits for specific exercise selection, but if someone said, oh, well, I want you to do a bench press, you wouldn't just think, oh, well, I guess I'll just do like a military press, because it's like, that's a completely different exercise. In the same way, the barbell row and the seal row, yes, they are both a pull exercise, but they target completely different muscle groups, and they target them in different ways. So it's shocking to me that there's a lot of things out there that are really easy to do, and people just don't do them. Another one that's always fascinated me is how I see a lot of people, working their way around wrist pain in squats, and they don't want necessarily to be able to squat heavy. They want to be able to use the squat. And it's like, okay, cool. You have a landmine press, right? Well, you can use that with a dip belt to improvise a belt squat. And that's a completely upper body free solution to having a squat. You can actually, set that up for someone, for instance, with one arm, and they're able to
Sounds like we lost you there for a sec, Jake. Towards the tail end there.
Sorry,
Can you
which
hear us, sorry?
yeah, I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go back about 15 seconds. What you were just saying.
Oh, did you catch the bit about the? I'll start again. So one of the other exercises that I always find shocked that people don't know about is the belt squat, which is a really good squat that actually utilizes a dip belt. And well, normally it's a platform and it's actually a cable-based setup or a plate-loaded setup. It's an entire machine, but with just a landmine press and a few blocks to stand on, you can actually improvise a belt squat with a dip belt. And so you can really, like, even at home, you could assemble a couple, let's say 100 pounds worth of equipment, maybe $150. And you can have that sort of belt squat setup ready to go. Whereas, I see gyms and stuff like that buying them. And really, even with a landmine press, people would go, oh, okay, well, I don't have a landmine press. Great. Well, you can improvise a landmine press with a tennis ball. And so there's all these different solutions that you can actually come up with if you just think a little bit more creatively, that enable you to go ahead and achieve the things you want. And that, I think, is a key part of anti-fragility, is having that ability to adapt on the fly in a way that doesn't take away from the main goal, right? Like, and I know Jocko thinks about this a lot. It's like, one of my favorite things that Jocko said in terms of mindset, but not in application, is, well, if I can't have good food, I'm just going to fast. And it's like, well, it's an excellent mindset solution, right? But that would be the equivalent of me going, well, I don't have a barbell to work out, so I'm just going to do core exercises on the floor. And while that may be a good solution for one person, if someone is a powerlifter, for instance, an hour-long core circuit consisting of thousands of reps is not going to be particularly useful for them.
Well, that comes about from people not being conscious enough of what they're actually in the gym for. It's like if they go in the gym and they think that they're there to do a bench press and they can't do a bench press, their mind doesn't go to, well, how do I replicate this? Their mind just goes to, oh, I can't do this thing. Because they aren't thinking long-term of what they're actually training. They're just thinking of, I'm here in the gym to do this particular set of exercises.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what's really interesting, something that's sort of like popping up too, is there's a gradient of sort of attitude and information. So it's like when you have this a kind of like anti-fragile attitude, it's like no matter what, I'm going to get a solid session in. It'll probably be good for that given day. Hypertrophy is interesting in the sense that it's both a fragile thing in the sense that it's very easy to be compromised by interference. Like any kind of hard conditioning within 48 hours of a hypertrophy session is going to cannibalize the gains from. I mean, there will be some gains, but it's going to cannibalize gains from a hypertrophy session. So it's sort of like farming, where you need like ideal conditions. You need good food, you need good rest. So like in a day, though, right? If all you're doing is hypertrophy and you're finding ways to get the dial of intensity up, whether through heavier weights or through volume, on that given day, you're going to be fine. If you're looking for a fat burn workout, you can do a Metcon that's sort of slapped together for a day and you can salvage something. That's also fine. But if you're trying to get somewhere, you're trying to establish progressions for more than one attribute of fitness over time, you're not trying to do CrossFit. What's fragile is not having the information. So you can have a good attitude of training till you're blue in the face, but you're not going to get to the 600-pound deadlift. You're not going to get to the sub 5 mile. You're not going to get to the 100-pound business team get up if you don't have enough information to actually establish programming to set progressions that don't interfere with each other. So a lack of information is also a very fragile thing. That being said, we outsource for a reason in life, right? Some lawyers have stockbrokers because they're not going to take the time to see trends in the market. People have lawyers for a reason. They don't know legal codes. That quite literally, these are professions of specialization they're professional forms of outsourcing. So you have to gauge, you have to not be fragile and see whether or not you have enough information to be successful in something to pair your attitude to pair an anti-fragile attitude with something, and to gauge whether or not you can learn enough information to make that up, or you need to figure out a way to outsource something. Jake, you still there? Oh,
Yeah, sorry. My phone dropped out there for a second. I think I got most of what you said. I think, yeah, there's definitely a line as well with the sort of like cost benefit of, for instance, it's like if I have a leg that has been cut off or has a gashing wound, is it quicker for me to call 999, right, and have an ambulance come to my door, or is it quicker for me to, hop online and enroll in a paramedics degree that's going to take me 3 to 5 years to complete? Now, of course, that's an extreme solution, but what I'm getting at with that is sometimes it can be way more cost and time efficient to actually to outsource, like you said, and it can be as well more anti-fragile. And the reason is in life is like, for instance, if you are traveling and you decide to use a travel agency, well, in a lot of cases, that travel agency has accepted responsibility for the extra cost of, for instance, your flights. So if the flight gets cancelled, right, they will actually put you on another flight. So in that instance, your flight is then anti-fragile to cancellation. And I think it's an important overlay that Taleb does touch on, but I think a lot of people miss because it's not presented every single time he brings up an idea. He doesn't reference it back to this point, but it is an important reference point, and that's that not everything that is anti-fragile is anti-fragile to everything, right? No one thing will respond to all stimuli the same. So, for instance, well, yes, the human body is anti-fragile to stress, in the physical realm. If I take 1,000 kilos and I put that on a barbell and I stick you underneath it in a bench press, and that falls on you and you choke to death, that's not particularly anti-fragile, despite the fact that with a lower weight, a significantly lower weight at that, you'd see great results repeated over many years. And I think it's something that people use to try and critique the idea of anti-fragility, not knowing that that's an established point. Is like, it's not that one thing is anti-fragile to everything, but what you have to do is be able to select how to make things anti-fragile through a stress analysis. So what is this thing that I'm trying to do stressful? What sort of stresses can occur to it, right? And what are potential threats, essentially. So for instance, with programming, it's like, if you go to the gym and you select a load of random exercises, you could work out for years before you even realize that you're not seeing any progress, right? Like I've seen and known people that are, they're in the gym and they have done not just the same workout for years, they've done the same workouts with the same weights. And I think that was especially common with the sort of boom generation and the rise of bodybuilding as a mainstream thing, as opposed to just a niche sport from the strongman world, where people were just going, quote unquote, like Drew said earlier, they are just going to the gym and they have this vague idea about what they want to do, but they haven't necessarily done the work or the time to see the results, to understand the science behind what they're trying to achieve.
Are you familiar with, does Taleb set any sort of benchmark to where, how do you determine, because like what you were saying a second ago, anti-fragility, it doesn't apply in all scenarios. Like you said, the human body is anti-fragile in some aspects and not in others. Does he set a benchmark for how do you determine in what ways your system needs to be anti-fragile?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes down the center line in the sense that you have to identify how many stressors there are, right? So you need a certain amount of stressors to actually force you into growth, but you don't need so many stressors that you reach this point of diminishing returns. But what's somewhat paradoxical about this is if you reach the point of diminishing returns with a bunch of stressors, you almost have to completely reorganize, right? I can give a perfect example that most people listening to this are going to be able to relate to is just COVID, the COVID pandemic, right? I can once again use myself as an example. I was making pretty significant money. I was making pretty significant money in Silicon Valley, or not in Silicon Valley, in the bartending world as a cocktail bar manager. And okay, great. So I'm working 30-hour weeks, and I have the perfect schedule to train martial arts. So this is great. Living in California, my overhead was about $3,000 a month. Those are my monthly costs. So As soon as COVID hit, that was such a stressor financially that I had to completely reorganize my life. The system at hand wasn't working anymore. It wasn't even that it could benefit from any kind of stressors. There were so many stressors that it just could not exist anymore. So what I did was I cut all the costs I had, except a section of rent and food, and I was eating food that was much lower in quality. Um, and I had to put together a system, a schedule for being able to commute 2 hours each way and sort of advance my life in the way that I want to advance my life. And I needed to find methods of training that wouldn't require sound nourishment and wouldn't require sound sleep. So what I would do is, since I had work at 10:30 p.m., I had a 2-hour commute. I'd be up at 7:30 p.m. I would get ready for an hour, pray, eat, so on and so forth. I'd walk to the BART. While on BART, I would read the books and the articles that were my education regarding sports science, or I would spend time reading inspiring literature to inspire the mind to write my own literature. So obviously, I can do these things as I'm riding the train. When I actually have to walk somewhere, reading a book as you're walking can be tried, but it's not exactly efficient. So I'd listen to a podcast of sorts, or if I was feeling particularly fatigued, I would just listen to some calm music to give my mind a break. And then I figured out the optimal. I figured out the optimal amount of time that a person can focus for and the amount of time he needs to recover. So I would divvy up my. It would be a total of 8.5 hours at work, because I would get off at 7 a.m. There's a half-hour lunch break. Of all that time, since all I needed to do was stare at a camera screen and do 4 rounds around the facility I was working overnight security in, I would divvy up all the time in an hour and a half increments of hard work, and then 20-minute increments of either reading or doing something as like simple to restore my focus, just watch Netflix and zone out, or stretch, or do burpees, something to get the blood flowing and wake me up. When I'd go home, I would take the BART home, and I would go to the gym when the sun was strongest, so I'd at least have the sun on my side. I'd eat and then go to sleep, right? So that system had I already had an absurd amount of stressors, which was bad food, bad sleep, bad income. So I needed to retreat, reorganize, and I was able to put myself in a scenario where I could add all the beneficial stressors right before it reached that threshold where I'd just be overwhelmed and fail. You have to sort of tailor everything to given circumstances. That's sort of the main thing about systems. Do you have anything else to add to that, Jake?
Yeah, I think one thing, while we're talking about the ideas of outsourcing and sort of optimal behavior selection, like do I drive to this place, or do I actually take the train because I can read a book and do some work at the same time? And I think this is a question a lot of commuters have sort of answered, and that can, in some cases, depending on the style of work that you need to get done, be one or the other. Is it more important that you are in the office for that extra 20 minutes either side, or can you do that extra? Oh, it's going to take me an extra 20 minutes on the train, but I can get an extra hour of work done either side, because I'm not having to focus on doing things. And in a way, what you're doing at that point is you're outsourcing your transport. And the other solution that you can sort of have when it comes to outsourcing as a benchmark, as Drew said, for how do I know when to do this, is something called the region beta paradox, which is essentially, if you have to travel a certain amount of distance, there is a distance under which it becomes quicker to get in the car and drive than walk. And this is something that's been spoken about a lot in, I see it sort of making its way a lot around podcasts at the moment. It's like, oh, what about this? And that question will look different depending on the specific scenario. But mapping that out can actually be done with a graph. And so I'm pretty sure you can find this graph online. But obviously, being able to calculate all situations mathematically isn't always possible. And I think a lot of these like optimal solution graphs, they're normally prefaced, if there's any good authors writing about them, they will normally preface by saying like, look, this isn't how it works in reality, but it can be a useful tool to consider. Ideas like optimal stopping and optimal searching. So, which is the idea of like, if I have to, if I'm, for instance, looking for a house, how many houses should I look at before I actually consider buying one? Should I just buy the first one I come across, or should I, look at half of them or 90% of them and then decide on the sort of last 10%? How many things in a given group should I use as a control group and then make my decision? And the answer to that, in mathematics at least, generally tends to be that you should look at a third of the group to establish a benchmark, and then the next option that comes across from the group that is better than the average, right, or is above standard essentially, is the one that you should take. So let's say, for instance, you were looking to buy a car and you had 10 cars to consider, and this is where the question sort of tends to fall apart, is that it doesn't consider the fact that in some options you can always go back. The given parameters for this question are, once you've looked at something, you can't go back and have a look at it. So for instance, like in buying a house, often once you've looked at a house, if you say no, it will eventually go. It'll be kind of rare that you'll be able to go back to a house and go, oh, hey, I know it's been a few weeks, but is there any way this is still on the market? If you're in a sort of like high, what's it called? I don't want to say a volatile housing market, but like a situation where houses are being bought and sold generally quite fast, then that might not be an option. Or for instance, job interviews is another one. So if you are on the other end of an application for a job, if you're employing, how many of those employees do you look at before you actually decide, right? Because if you don't get back to them quick enough, these guys are all looking for a job. They're going to decide on a different job. So I think that the idea of optimal stopping, optimal searching, and the region beta paradox, they can all be useful tools and concepts to consider when we talk about when should I outsource or when should I do this myself.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of in terms of when to make that call, I think I see this sort of made incorrectly by younger cats. Not necessarily in terms of outsourcing, but in terms of when they need, particularly advanced exercises, or when they ever need particular advanced coaching classes. Like a tried and true example of this is in the martial arts world, where the newbie who clearly isn't ready to be on the fight team, like, insists that they want to be on the fight team, or insists that they need complicated exercises, or the reason why they're not advancing is because they can't afford a particular supplement. It's a form of putting the cart before the horse, and it's probably the most fragile way to be, because it's, at the end of the day, it's probably the route to the most inaction and the most victim mindset. And there's so many things that you're leaving on the table before you get to the point where you actually need a change in external factors before you see any more growth. You know what it feels like when you're sort of maxed out in a place. I know what it felt like when I outgrew a fighting gym. When the coach is really good, but the other people there weren't really challenging, and I knew I needed to be in a room full of people who were just better than me. It wasn't just good coaching. I needed the better support staff as well. I know what it's like when, the 5-3-1 split stopped working, reached the point of diminishing returns. So that point is very similar to the point of when you need to outsource, where it's like, okay, this is at a point where if I research this anymore, it's going to take away from my main goal. So I'm just going to outsource it now. And we actually get a lot of people who were pretty good at making fitness programs for themselves, and then they're just like, okay, so I'm at a point where I just don't know enough, and I don't have the time to know enough. So come to Anti-Fragile Fitness, which is a very anti-fragile decision. We'll leave it at that today, guys. Anything else before we go?
No, all good here.
All good.
Fantastic. Well, to everyone listening, God bless. Happy training. See you next time.